The video hasn't even started, and I'm already thrown off by how the #1 Marxist on YouTube refers to himself as the #1 Marxist on YouTube. Jason Unruhe, as you can clearly tell, is a Marxist, which is just a dogmatic communist. And communism is a system where power in a society is equilibrated, basically. In other words, everyone is on an equal playing ground. So being #1 makes him the bourgeoisie in this instance, which he appears to be embracing.
Now that is irony!
Freedom of speech. It's a very difficult subject. It's far removed from the "I defend your right to freedom of speech" that we're used to hearing about. I believe it was Voltaire who said, "I don't like what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it."
Freedom of speech in and of itself is not removed by its being defended in any way. Those who understand its importance understand that the freedom to speak applies to everyone, like Voltaire did, even if some persons say something that others don't like.
Because freedom of speech is much more complex than that.
Just a heads up, he's going to say something like this quite a few times in this video.
Everybody says, "I believe in freedom of speech," but how many people really do?
Personally, I don't believe in freedom of speech, or anything for that matter. If something is factual, and in this case undoubtedly beneficial for society, then believing in it isn't necessary. I'll elaborate on this point later in the video.
Take any person who says, "I believe in freedom of speech," and ask them, "Okay, so do you want to invest in my child pornography business?"
I should have let you. What the fuck?
And they'll say, "Whoa, no, whoa. I don't support that. But I thought you said you support free speech. So somebody should be able to say what they want."
They said they supported free speech. So what would make one think that that meant they were automatically supportive of putting children in depraved and traumatizing situations? The initiation of force is not synonymous with speaking about initiating force. And regardless of a business's legality or ethics, we have the right to not invest in them if we do not want to.
Oh, well, I mean, there should be limits, of course.
Yes, there should be limits. You can talk about molesting kids all you want. I personally don't care, but do not literally molest kids. I and any other decent human being take serious issue with that.
And in lies the problem.
Yes, the problem is that Jason clearly has no idea what freedom of speech is.
While just about everybody does believe in free speech, nobody really does believe in free speech.
Alrighty then.
We all believe in limitations in some form or another. Anyone who holds this position that they defend all speech no matter what is either crazy or a liar. Because it's far more complicated than that.
Who holds that position? Supporting someone's freedom to say what they want is not the same as supporting what someone is saying. I don't support what Jason is saying, but I abide by the notion that he has every right to say it.
Now, let's look at another common situation. Someone's being racist, and somebody comes up and says, "Stop being intolerant. We're not going to tolerate intolerance." And that person turns around and says, "You're being intolerant of my intolerance. You're a hypocrite." And then that person replies, "You complaining about intolerance when you're being intolerant makes you a hypocrite." In actuality, both of them are being hypocrites. It actually is true. They're both being that way.
Again, intolerance for what someone is saying is not the same as being intolerant of freedom of speech. Those persons in his example would only be hypocritical if they were using force, either by themselves or the state, to silence the other.
Because it's far more complicated than that, and you end up in this really terrible paradox of trying to understand free speech and what constitutes free speech and what doesn't.
Call it a hunch, but I have a feeling that freedom of speech is only complicated and paradoxical to him.
Because in reality, speech is controlled, and always should be controlled. There should always be limits. There is no this liberal idea of there just being free speech.
Controlled by whom? Why should speech be controlled in any way? Professor Deirdre McCloskey has this video on learnliberty.org, which, in my opinion, describes perfectly how a free society depends on free speech. We can either use rhetoric in a society of free speech, or we can use violence in a society of controlled speech. That's not a belief either. That's a given. I'll put a link of the video in the description. You should absolutely check it out.
Because, to use an example, the Founding Fathers said, free speech, but they weren't very specific on that.
Well, it isn't like the framers forgot to include a list of things Americans should or shouldn't say. Free speech is free speech. You can't get any more specific than that.
Does that mean somebody could come in and argue that the British Crown should come back into the country? Well, they would probably say no.
That isn't hard to believe.
If a communist stood up in their time and said, you know what, we should probably completely overthrow all of the rich people and replace it with egalitarianism, they would certainly say, no, you're not allowed to say that.
They would certainly say. I don't know the Founding Fathers personally, but I'm pretty sure they wouldn't say, you're not allowed to say that. They would probably say something along the lines of, that's a stupid idea, here's why.
In our modern day, there's all kinds of speech that aren't allowed, hate speech, etc.
I like how he mentions that there's all kinds of speech that aren't allowed and only touches upon hate speech. Speech doesn't need to be categorized, and it shouldn't. Anyone who feels the need to impose an idea of speech that is or isn't allowed is no proponent of free speech.
Because we shouldn't ever reduce it to simply being free speech. I believe in free speech. No, you don't. You believe in this.
Regardless of what someone believes, free speech, as Deirdre McCloskey makes clear in her video, is most beneficial to society.
If we say, no, don't blame all Muslims for terrorism, and, we're going to censor you if you say something that's insanely Islamophobic, they turn around and say, oh my God, you don't believe in freedom of speech. And then someone who's Christian turns around and says, you're trying to promote homophobia by allowing gay marriage. And when we try to argue against it, you shout us down. As homophobes, you're restricting our freedom of speech.
I don't know who this we Jason keeps referring to is, but no one, save for the state, is censoring what anyone is saying in the open marketplace of ideas, whether it's about Islam or gay marriage. I guess he's trying to point out that there are certain media outlets that refuse to promote certain kinds of material, and that's perfectly understandable and should be accepted. Those are primarily private institutions, and they have the right to put out whatever information they want. And that's why we have the internet. For now, at least.
Because it's much more complicated than that. What we should do is come up with a definition of what speech should be free and what speech should not be free.
If Jason and this proverbial we want to organize and create this place where speech is controlled and restricted, he can be my guest, just so long as he doesn't force me and others who actually value free speech to join them.
Because there's no one who really believes in this ultimate freedom of speech, because it just doesn't exist.
Maybe free speech doesn't exist in its ultimate form today because of people like Jason who take free speech for granted. And he would even take political advice from one of the most ruthless dictators whose rule caused one of the worst famines in human history.
What does this lead me to? One section in On Contradiction that Mao wrote.
What did I tell you?
He wrote, there are two kinds of contradictions in society. Contradictions between people and contradictions between the people and the enemy.
I went and read On Contradiction for this occasion, and one of the things I found was that Mao didn't write that.
There's a very notable difference. Contradictions between the people are not antagonistic. The contradictions between the people and the enemies of the people are antagonistic.
That's actually more along the lines of what he did write.
The contradictions between the people and the various groups can be solved by debate, with free speech, with all manner of, debate, bring it to parliament, voting, what have you. The contradiction between the people and the enemy should never have free speech. The enemy is not entitled to have free speech. That's the whole point of a dictatorship of the proletariat, is to hammer down the bourgeois, confiscate their property, ban the landlords, prevent them from having free speech.
Putting aside that a proletariat dictatorship sounds contradictory on its own, at this point I'm guessing that Jason has dropped his point of reference and is just putting his own spin on it, because nothing he just said is mentioned in On Contradiction. If he is taking creative liberties, then all I have to ask is this, but first to quote Mao's own words in On Contradiction, the study of various conditions of unevenness in the contradiction, the study of the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradictions, of the principal aspect and the non-principal aspect of a contradiction constitutes one of the important methods by which a revolutionary political party determines correctly its political and military, strategic, and tactical directives. All communists should note this. How exactly will the proletariat dictatorship understand the contradictions and its aspects by silencing the opposition?
So the next time you're talking about free speech or you hear somebody else talking about free speech, think about that. And just remember that even when you're arguing about free speech, it's far more complicated, is much more complex, because it's far more complicated. Because it's far more complicated than that. Because it's much more complicated than just merely supporting it or not supporting it.
You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.